Hey guys, welcome back to Bake Me Happy. This week, in light of the Mexican holiday, Day of the Dead, we decided that we would make a sugar skull cake. I started by making 2 butter cakes and dyeing them red, and I baked them in a rectangular tin. If you have a oval kind of tin or a circular tin that you would prefer to use, by all means use that because it will make carving easier, but I did find that for me, baking it in a rectangular tin would be the easiest option. After I baked the cakes, I let them cool completely and then wrapped them in Glad Wrap and froze them overnight so that they'd be easier to carve. So I started by making a really small batch of buttercream just because we are going to use fondant for this cake. It's pretty sweet, so I didn't want to overpower with the sweetness, so I just used a really small amount. And I spread that between the 2 layers of the rectangular cake, and then I did it on the bench, but if you have a cake board and you want to do it on the cake board, by all means do that. So I got my serrated edge knife and a little paring knife, and I started cutting off the larger chunks with the bread knife. And then I was using a template that my friend had drawn for me, and I put that on top of the cake just to go as a guide. I'd shrunk it to the correct size and everything. And then I took a little paring knife and went through and did the finer details. So I started carving things like the cheekbones, the inner parts of the chin, and just rounding out the head and the corners and everything. So once I'd completely carved the cake and got it to a shape that I liked, I peeled off the template that I was using and set that aside. I then took a cake board. I just used a piece of cardboard that I covered with some alfoil, but if you want to buy a cake board, by all means do that. I can leave the dimensions for that in the description box below. So I stuck it onto the cake board with a really small amount of buttercream, and then I moved it back. So I then took the rest of my buttercream and I used it as a crumb coat. I started by doing the edges of the cake because these are the parts with the most crumbs. Obviously, because I haven't leveled the cakes, there's still that kind of crust on the top. So I went through with my offset spatula and I smoothed all around the edges, making sure to keep the cheekbones really sharp. So I went through and did that, and then after I was happy with the sides and that everything was covered, I went through and did the top. This was just to mainly make sure that the fondant had something to stick to more than anything. I mean, it doesn't really matter if the crumbs got in this coat, which is why it was so thin. So I put that into the fridge for a little while just to set up, just to make sure that the crumbs weren't going to go everywhere. And I started rolling out some white fondant. I had about 600 grams of white fondant, and I was rolling that out, but I did end up having quite a bit left over. So I mostly eyeballed this, and I had a look at it and was just kind of comparing it to the cake constantly to make sure that it was going to be the right size and was going to be able to cover all the edges. So I was rolling it out, and then I rolled it onto the rolling pin, but this part was really hard, so we didn't actually get a very good shot of it. But I rolled it out on top of the cake because I had to work pretty quickly, because otherwise the fondant was going to stretch and tear and I would have to start all over again. So I covered it with the fondant, and then to kind of get it all around the curves and the pointy bits, I was stretching it out a little bit and then using my hand to smooth it down, and then stretching it a little bit more and smoothing it down, being very careful not to tear it. I almost did in one place, but we avoided that, so that was good. So then I went through with my paring knife, and I was very careful not to cut the alfoil on my cake board, but I went through and cut a really basic kind of shape around it so that there was still a thick amount around the cake so that I did have some room to work. So I peeled that off, put it to the side, and then started going in close to the shape, into the shape of the cake. So I was pushing with my pinky kind of underneath the edges of the cake to make sure that the fondant was all the way around it and it looked very seamless, because I didn't want any cake or icing poking out the bottom, especially because the alfoil is reflective. You're going to be able to see that if it happens. So I went through with my paring knife very slowly and very carefully to make sure that it was all correct. I did muck it up a little bit, but that's okay. So I pushed it all in, made sure it was all correct and how I wanted it. I made sure there were no folds around the bottom of the cake, which was really key for me, especially because I had made those little tears at the bottom. So I did that and I set it aside completely. I then went through and made some royal icing. If you guys want to see a recipe for that, leave a comment down below and give this video a thumbs up. So I went and I adjusted the consistency so it was just right for my stiffer parts of the icing, because it's always easier to add more liquid than it is to add more icing sugar. I then divided it into 6 bowls and I put most of it in one because I knew that I was going to be using a lot of black to do all of the outlining. So I mixed in with some liquid food colouring. This was probably a mistake, but I mean if you have gel, do use gel. But even though I only got it to a dark grey colour, on the cake it did look very black, which was pretty pleasing. So I used the liquid food colour, mixed that in until I got a really dark colour that I was happy with, and then I had to add a little bit more icing sugar to get the consistency right. But I did that and I added it to a piping bag with no tip. If you do have a really small tip, obviously you can use that, but because I don't, I just used the like snip. I just like to snip the bottom of the piping bag to a really small tip. I coloured the rest of my icings blue, green, pink, orange and yellow. I mixed them in pretty well. The pink I did have a little bit of trouble with, but that's fine. I kept with more of a pastel kind of colour in that sense anyway. So I went through, put them all into their separate piping bags and set them aside. So I brought my cake back over to the workbench and I went through with the black icing and piped. I had my design next to me and I did the eyes first and then piped from the top down, which I found was a lot easier to do because the top of my skull was a lot more simple than the bottom, as you can probably see in the design. So I started with the eyes and just kind of took the template, measured it with a knife and made some indents just to make sure that I could see it, and then went with that. They did end up a little bit uneven, but it's not the end of the world. So I did all the parts of the skull right down to the bottom, and then I had a look at it the right way up just to make sure that everything was sitting correctly and that I didn't want to add anything else. I did want to keep in mind though that I was going to add some extra details with the colour, which would kind of expand a lot of the design so that it would pop a little bit more. So yellow was my first colour and I really wanted to keep in mind that I didn't go overboard with it because I do have 4 other colours still to put onto the cake. So I went through and did all the details with the yellow, and then I took the orange, did the same thing, and then the blue, the pink and the green. I did leave the heart in the centre of the skull till the very last bit of decorating, just because I wanted to make sure that it was all well balanced and it kind of looked right. I did originally plan to make it pink, but when I got to the end I decided that all the yellow had kind of been pushed to the outside, so I wanted to put some yellow and bring the colour into the centre of the face again. So I put the yellow in the skull and then it was completely finished. So with this part of the cake, it is really important that you get creative. I don't really have a hugely creative side, so I did ask my friend to create my design for me, but we went through a process where we were eliminating, she drew a couple and then I told her what I liked, what I didn't like, and we worked together to put it together. So I'd like to thank her for that. But you can do anything that you want. You can look up on the internet some pictures of them. There's plenty of photos, plenty of information about them out there. You can see what you like. Some of them have crosses in the center, some of them have more intricate flowers. I just decided that it would be easier to do a more basic kind of thing. As you can see, I did struggle a little bit with the design, but it was very fiddly. One other thing is that you could also even try black fondant underneath. You'd obviously have to buy that pre-coloured, but that would make it stand out a lot better, and if you had some white edging instead of black edging like I had, again, it would be a lot easier. So that's all for the video today. I really hope that you enjoyed watching this video and that I've inspired you to go and create something that you've never tried before. It's really important that you're okay with making mistakes because it happens when you bake. So if you liked this video and you want to see more from me, make sure you click subscribe, it'll be right over there. Check out my 2 previous videos and all of my social media will be down below. Give this video a thumbs up and comment what you'd like to see down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye!